We all go through moments in life when we feel overwhelmed, uncertain, or even afraid. The weight of problems, financial struggles, broken relationships, health concerns, can make us anxious and restless. We try to fix everything on our own, searching for answers, but often we are left exhausted and discouraged. But today, I want to remind you of a powerful truth. Leave everything in God's hands, because He will handle it. Life is full of uncertainties. No matter how much we plan, prepare, and work toward our goals, there will always be moments when things do not go as expected. Situations arise that are beyond our control, unexpected hardships, sudden loss, or difficult challenges that shake our faith. In times like these, we may find ourselves asking, why is this happening? Where is God in all of this? But the truth is, even when life seems chaotic, God is in control. Throughout history, we see countless examples of God working behind the scenes, even when things appeared to be falling apart. Consider the story of Joseph in the Bible. He was betrayed by his own brother, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. From a human perspective, everything in his life seemed unfair and out of control. Yet, through all of this, God was orchestrating a greater plan. Eventually, Joseph rose to power in Egypt, saved an entire nation from famine, and even reconciled with his brothers. What others meant for harm, God used for good. This reminds us that even when we cannot see the bigger picture, God is always working behind the scenes for our good. One of the hardest things for us to do as humans is to surrender control. We want to fix things on our own, solve our problems, and dictate how our lives should go. But when we take control into our own hands, we often end up feeling anxious, exhausted, and defeated. The more we try to handle everything by ourselves, the more overwhelmed we become. This is why the Bible repeatedly tells us to trust God rather than rely on our own understanding. Proverbs 3:05-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." This verse is a powerful reminder that when we let go and trust God, He will guide us on the right path. Sometimes God allows us to go through difficult seasons to teach us dependence on Him. If life were always easy, we would have no reason to seek Him or trust in His power. Trials refine our faith and help us grow spiritually. Romans 8:28 reassures us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Even when things seem to be falling apart, God is actually putting everything together for a greater purpose. Our job is not to understand every detail of His plan, but to trust that He is in control. In moments of uncertainty, one of the greatest sources of peace is knowing that God's sovereignty never changes. The same God who created the universe, who parted the Red Sea, who raised Lazarus from the dead, and who calmed the storm with a single word, is the same God who is in control of our lives today. He has not abandoned us. He sees every tear, hears every prayer, and knows every struggle we face. His hands are strong enough to carry us through any storm. And Isaiah 41:10 reminds us of God's faithfulness. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." So no matter what you are going through right now, whether it is a financial struggle, a health crisis, or an emotional burden, take a deep breath and remind yourself, God is in control. You do not have to figure everything out. You do not have to have all the answers. You just need to trust in the one who holds the universe in His hands. If God can sustain the stars in the sky and keep the earth in perfect balance, He can certainly take care of you. When we truly believe that God is in control, we can live with peace, knowing that no situation is too big for Him to handle. Instead of worrying, we can pray. Instead of stressing, we can worship. Instead of doubting, we can trust. Because in the end, God's plan is always greater than our own. Trust over understanding. One of the most challenging things in life is trusting God when we do not understand what He is doing. As human beings, we naturally want to have control over our lives, to know what lies ahead, and to make sense of every situation. However, life does not always give us clear answers. And many times we find ourselves facing circumstances that seem unfair, confusing, or even painful. In those moments, we are faced with a choice. either to trust in God's wisdom or to lean on our own understanding. The Bible makes it clear in Proverbs 3:05-06, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. This verse teaches us that trusting God is not about having all the answers, but about believing that He does. When we rely on our own understanding, we often limit ourselves to what we can see, feel, and comprehend. But God operates beyond what is visible. He sees the bigger picture, the past, present, and future all at once. What may seem like a setback to us could actually be a setup for something greater. Many times in the Bible, God's plans did not make sense to those who were experiencing them. Consider Noah, who was told to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. To the world, his obedience looked foolish, but in the end, God's plan was perfect. Think about Job, who lost everything, his wealth, health, and family, yet God was working in the background to restore him beyond what he had before. These stories remind us that just because we do not understand God's ways does not mean He is not in control. Trusting God over our own understanding requires surrender. It means accepting that His ways are higher than our ways and that He knows what is best for us. It is easy to trust Him when things are going well, but true faith is tested in the difficult seasons. When prayers seem unanswered, when doors close, when disappointments come, that is when we must hold on to His promises. Romans 8:28 assures us, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Even when life does not make sense, we can trust that God is working all things together for our good. Choosing to trust over understanding does not mean that we will never feel fear, doubt, or uncertainty. It simply means that we choose faith over fear. It means saying, God, I do not know what you are doing, but I trust that you are leading me in the right direction. It means refusing to let worry and anxiety take over and instead choosing to rest in His promises. When we truly trust God, we experience peace that surpasses all understanding because we know that no matter what happens, He is in control. Isaiah 26:03 tells us, you will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. If you are facing a situation today that does not make sense, remember that God is not asking you to figure it all out. He is asking you to trust Him. His timing is perfect, His plans are good, and His love for you is greater than anything you can imagine. Do not let the need for understanding keep you from trusting Him. Surrender your worries, your fears, and your doubts to Him. He is faithful, and He will make a way even when there seems to be none. Keep your faith strong. Hold on to His promises, and remember, you do not have to understand everything. You just need to trust the one who does. Worry is something that every human being struggles with at some point in life. It creeps into our thoughts when we least expect it, causing anxiety and restlessness. We worry about our future, our families, our finances, our health, and even things we cannot control. But the truth is, worrying does not solve our problems. It only drains our energy, steals our peace, and weakens our faith. That is why God calls us to surrender our worries to Him. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is an open invitation to lay down our anxieties and trust that God will take care of everything. Many times we hold on to our worries because we feel responsible for figuring everything out. We think that if we just try harder or plan better, we can fix the situation. But this mindset leads to unnecessary stress and frustration. The reality is that some things are beyond our control, and trying to handle them on our own only makes things worse. That is why the Bible encourages us in Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. This verse is a reminder that God does not want us to carry the weight of our problems alone. He is ready and willing to take our burdens, but we must be willing to let go. Surrendering our worries to God does not mean ignoring our responsibilities or pretending our problems do not exist. It means recognizing that God is bigger than our struggles and trusting Him to work things out according to His perfect will. When we worry, we are essentially saying that we do not fully trust God to handle our situation. But faith requires us to believe that even when things seem uncertain, God is still in control. Philippians 4:6-7 gives us a clear instruction on how to deal with worry. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This verse tells us that instead of worrying, we should pray, give thanks, and trust that God will provide the peace we need. One of the best examples of surrendering worries to God is found in the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow and distress. He knew the suffering that awaited him, and in his humanity he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." Even in his darkest moment, Jesus chose to surrender to God's will. His prayer teaches us that surrender is not about denying our emotions, but about trusting God despite them. If Jesus, the Son of God, relied on the Father in his moment of distress, how much more should we surrender our worries to him? When we surrender our worries, we experience true peace. This does not mean that all our problems will disappear instantly, but it does mean that we no longer have to carry the burden alone. God gives us the strength to endure, the wisdom to make the right decisions, and the assurance that he is working everything for our good. Worry adds nothing to our lives. It only robs us of the joy and peace that God wants us to have. As Jesus reminds us in Matthew 6:27, can any one of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? Worrying does not change the outcome, but trusting God does. If you are struggling with worry today, take a moment to pause and surrender it to God. Pray and release your fears, knowing that he is in control. Let go of the need to understand everything and trust that he has a plan far greater than anything you can imagine. The more we surrender, the more we experience his peace. And when we truly leave everything in God's hands, we will see that he handles it far better than we ever could. God fights our battles. Life is full of battles. Some we see coming and others take us by surprise. We face challenges in our finances, relationships, health, and spiritual lives. Sometimes the fight is external, with circumstances that seem impossible to overcome, and other times it is an internal struggle with fear, doubt, or anxiety. In these moments, we often feel the need to fight on our own, to figure things out, and to push through in our own strength. But the truth is, we are not meant to fight alone. The Bible repeatedly reminds us that God fights our battles and that our victory does not depend on our strength, but on his power. One of the most powerful examples of God fighting for his people is found in the story of David and Goliath. When the Israelite army faced the Philistine giant, Goliath, they were terrified. He was bigger, stronger, and more experienced in battle than anyone in their army. But then came David, a young shepherd with no military training, yet full of faith. He did not rely on armor or weapons. Instead, he declared in 1 Samuel 17:47, "The battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." With a single stone and complete trust in God, David defeated Goliath, showing us that no matter how big our battles seem, they are nothing compared to the power of God. Often we feel overwhelmed because we focus on the size of our problems rather than the greatness of our God. The enemy wants us to believe that we are alone, that our struggles are too great, and that we are not strong enough to overcome them. But Exodus 14:14 reminds us, the Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still. This was the promise God gave the Israelites when they were trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's approaching army. From a human perspective, there was no escape, no way to win, but God was not limited by their circumstances. He parted the sea, made a way where there was none, and delivered his people from their enemies. The same God who fought for them fights for us today. When we try to fight our battles on our own, we end up exhausted and discouraged. We carry burdens we were never meant to bear, trying to control things that only God can handle. But 2 Chronicles 20:15 tells us, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." When King Jehoshaphat faced a massive enemy army, he prayed and sought the Lord. Instead of sending soldiers to fight first, he sent worshipers ahead of the army, praising God. As they worshiped, God confused their enemies and gave them victory without them even lifting a sword. This story teaches us that sometimes the way to win a battle is not through fighting, but through surrender. trusting God to work in ways we cannot see. Faith does not mean we sit back and do nothing. It means we do our part while trusting God to do His. This might mean praying instead of worrying, worshiping instead of complaining, or stepping forward in obedience even when we are afraid. Isaiah 41:10 assures us, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." God does not leave us alone in our struggles. He equips us with His strength, gives us wisdom, and fights on our behalf. If you are facing a battle today, whether it is a difficult decision, a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or a personal struggle, remember that you are not alone. God is with you, and He is fighting for you. Instead of relying on your own strength, turn to Him in faith. Pray, trust, and surrender the battle into His hands. When we leave everything in God's hands, He not only fights for us, but He leads us to victory in ways we never imagined. No matter how impossible things seem, with God on your side, you are never defeated. Fear is one of the greatest obstacles that prevent us from fully trusting in God. It paralyzes us, fills our minds with doubt, and makes us question whether God is really in control. Fear often arises when we face uncertainty, when we do not know how things will turn out, when we feel unprepared, or when we focus on our weaknesses instead of God's strength. But the Bible teaches us that faith is greater than fear. Faith allows us to move forward even when we do not have all the answers. It reminds us that God is with us, guiding our steps, and that His power is greater than any challenge we face. One of the most well-known stories about faith overcoming fear is the story of Peter walking on water. In Matthew 14:28-31, when Peter saw Jesus walking on the sea, he stepped out of the boat in faith. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to walk on the water. But the moment he focused on the wind and waves around him, fear took over and he began to sink. Jesus reached out and saved him, saying, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" This story illustrates an important truth. When we focus on Jesus, faith keeps us steady, but when we focus on our fears, we begin to sink. Fear does not come from God. 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Fear is a tool that the enemy uses to weaken our trust in God and to keep us from stepping into His plans. When we allow fear to take root in our hearts, we hesitate, we hold back, and we start to believe the lies that say we are not strong enough, capable enough, or worthy enough. But faith reminds us that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. Faith says, "I may not know what the future holds, but I know who holds my future." Faith over fear does not mean that we will never feel afraid. It means that when fear comes, we choose to trust God anyway. The Bible is filled with promises that remind us not to be afraid. One of the most repeated commands in Scripture is, "Do not fear." In Isaiah 41:10, God assures us, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This verse reminds us that we do not have to face our fears alone. God is always with us, giving us the strength we need. One of the most powerful ways to overcome fear is through prayer. When we feel overwhelmed, we can bring our fears to God and ask Him for peace. Philippians 4:6-7 encourages us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Prayer shifts our focus from the problem to the one who is bigger than the problem. It reminds us that God is in control, even when we feel uncertain. Faith also requires action. Trusting God does not mean sitting back and doing nothing. It means stepping forward even when we do not see the whole picture. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, they had every reason to be afraid. The Egyptian army was behind them, and there was no visible way of escape. But God told Moses to lift his staff and step forward in faith. When he obeyed, God parted the sea and made a way where there was none. This teaches us that sometimes God waits for us to take the first step in faith before He reveals the way forward. If you are struggling with fear today, take a moment to remind yourself of God's promises. Choose to believe that He is greater than your fears. Instead of letting fear control your life, step out in faith and trust that God is leading you. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to trust God despite the fear. When we walk by faith, we will see God move in ways we never imagined. Fear may whisper doubts, but faith declares that with God, all things are possible. God's timing is perfect. One of the hardest lessons in life is learning to wait on God's timing. As human beings, we like to be in control. We want answers immediately, solutions right away, and blessings without delay. But God does not operate on our schedule. His timing is different from ours. And while we may feel like He is taking too long, He is never late. Ecclesiastes 3:11 reminds us, He has made everything beautiful in its time. This verse tells us that God knows exactly when to act, and when He does, it is always perfect. Waiting on God's timing can be difficult, especially when we are in a season of struggle or uncertainty. We often pray for breakthroughs, open doors, or clear direction, but when things do not happen as quickly as we hope, we become frustrated. We start questioning if God has forgotten about us. But the truth is, God's delays are not His denials. Sometimes He withholds something because it is not the right time. Other times, He is preparing us for what is coming. Isaiah 60:22 says, "When the time is right, I, the Lord, will make it happen." This verse is a reminder that when God is ready to act, nothing can stop Him. The Bible is filled with stories of people who had to wait on God's perfect timing. Abraham and Sarah were promised a child, but they waited 25 years before Isaac was born. In their impatience, they tried to rush God's plan, which led to complications. But when the time was right, God fulfilled His promise. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but he spent years as a slave and in prison before God elevated him to a position of power. During those difficult years, it may have seemed like God had forgotten him, but every step was part of God's plan to prepare him for his destiny. David was anointed as king while he was still a shepherd boy, but he had to wait many years and go through many trials before he finally took the throne. These stories remind us that just because something is delayed does not mean it will not happen. God is always working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see it. One of the biggest mistakes we make is trying to force things to happen in our own strength. When we grow impatient, we make impulsive decisions that can lead to unnecessary struggles. But when we wait on God, we allow Him to align things perfectly. Psalm 37:7 tells us, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him." Waiting is not easy, but it teaches us to trust God fully. It builds our faith and strengthens our character. James 1:04 says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." There is always a purpose in the waiting. While we wait, it is important to remain faithful. Waiting on God does not mean sitting back and doing nothing. It means continuing to pray, obey, and trust Him even when we do not see results. Galatians 6:9 encourages us, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." The key is to remain steadfast, knowing that God's plan is unfolding exactly as it should. If you are in a season of waiting, do not be discouraged. God knows your needs, your prayers, and your desires. He is not ignoring you. He's preparing something better than you could ever imagine. Sometimes what we think is a delay is actually God's protection. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what is best for us. Instead of stressing over when things will happen, choose to trust that God's timing is always perfect. When we leave everything in His hands, we will see that He handles it far better than we ever could. His plans are greater, His ways are higher, and His timing is never wrong. Leaving everything in God's hands is the ultimate act of faith. It means surrendering our worries, trusting that He fights our battles, choosing faith over fear, and believing that His timing is perfect. Life often presents challenges that seem overwhelming, but when we rely on God, we find peace, strength, and direction. Worry does not solve problems, faith does. Fear does not open doors, trust does. Impatience does not bring blessings, God's perfect timing does. No matter what we face, we are never alone. God is always working behind the scenes, guiding us, protecting us, and preparing us for what is to come. Instead of carrying burdens we were never meant to bear, we must release them into His capable hands. When we truly trust Him, we experience His peace and power. Let go, trust, and watch how God handles everything far better than we ever could.